Hello everyone, and welcome to this long overdue second part to What Makes a Good Costume. In this video, I dive into the colors, details, and fabrics of Amazon's The Rings of Power costumes. And I provide you with a breakdown of why most of the costumes in the show don't look all that great. If you like them, that's perfectly fine, of course, but if some of them look off to you, maybe you can find some explanations in this analysis. First, I want to address something, because I've seen a fair bit of comments on my costumes videos saying things along the lines of, it's just fantasy, it doesn't need to be historical or historically accurate. Historically accurate? No. But I maintain that even fantasy should be grounded in reality to some extent. Because even for fantasy, you will take inspiration from somewhere in the world or in history in order to design costumes that will not just look like a Picasso painting of influences and will be complementary to the fictional world, its rules and ways of life.
Richard Taylor's philosophy was always ground this in reality, want gritty realism. While we didn't want to make it obvious, like you go, oh look, the elves are Greek or the dwarves are this or that. We wanted to create alternative cultures that look like they could come straight out of history, but you're never quite sure where they're from.
I would say that grounding fantasy in reality makes it believable. In The Rings of Power, there is indeed some consistency when it comes to the cultures that influence these fictional ones, although this consistency isn't always maintained. And what's stranger is that the same influences can be observed cross-culturally, which can make you think that everyone looks kind of similar, all these fictional cultures, through these shared elements. For example, Grecian and Roman influences for both Numenor, but also kind of for elves when you look at Gil-galad's crown and the cape design, as well as for the dwarven women, for example Disa's dress and some of the dwarven women's dresses. Here I might also note the short hair that the elves are wearing in The Rings of Power. While I personally disagree with this style for Tolkien's elves, I'm going to play the devil's advocate and defend this hair on the following. I think the costumes department did want the overall feel of the show to evoke Greco-Roman times, both through costumes and hair, to some extent, setting it in an era before The Lord of the Rings. So basically some type of era that comes before the medieval times that we could say influenced many of the Lord of the Rings outfits. So from that point of view, perhaps they were aiming for the shorter hairstyles as we see them on Greek and Roman statues or paintings. This is just my speculation, but if this is indeed the case, while I again disagree with the style for Tolkien's elves and I'm not sure whether the execution is that great, I can still acknowledge that if this is indeed their source of influence, that there is some consistency here once again in terms of the influences that they used, even though I think it lacks coherence. Now, if I continue with the question that I presented in the previous video, what makes a good costume? I believe that suitable materials and fabrics are one of the key elements of making believable costumes. This should go without saying, and it's quite obvious, really. Cut corners when choosing the materials, and your end product will not come together quite as it should. But why is this such a big factor? Well, different fabrics have different thickness, weight, feel, flexibility, and all this affects how a garment fits a person, how it behaves when a person moves, how it comes across on camera. Textured fabrics and layers will have a different overall look and feel to them as opposed to flat, single-layered fabrics. Thinner, sheer fabrics will be drapey and flowy, and thicker, tightly woven fabrics will be more compact and sturdy. That's also important in regards to where the character lives and to give us the idea of the climate there. In The Rings of Power, you have Bronwyn in this light dress with straps and even a leg slit, and then Theo in a thick, warm leather overlayer with fur around the color, along with several villagers who are also dressed in sheepskin jackets and leather jackets and so on. This, I think, is an example of something that also breaks the consistency and makes one costume appear different than most of the others in the same general area. Now, materials, historically, were a symbol of wealth and status. Intricate lace, embroidery, and other details used to cost a ton because they were difficult to make and the materials they were made from were expensive to acquire. So materials, and especially embellishments, tell you that whoever is wearing such items is wealthy enough to afford them, and in terms of the character, it tells you something about their background, culture, and so on.
So how much of an investment would an outfit like this have been?
So you have around your collar this bertha, as it's known. This would be the equivalent around your shoulders of perhaps a very expensive sports car, perhaps even a yacht.
Details like lace and embroidery are indeed a lot more affordable nowadays, but they still add that element of prestige to a garment. They elevate it and show that something more went into making it. It's real, tangible, intricate. It can be regal and dainty, or it can be just an indication of craftsmanship, of skill, and show that there is a handmade element to the garment, which means that more time and more money was likely spent on it. I do miss some of that in the Rings of Power, especially among elven and dwarven nobility. We have Gil-galad parading around in a golden cape because gold means status, I suppose. And we have Disa, who wears a golden necklace with hanging triangles, as opposed to this regular dwarven woman who wears just a golden necklace, otherwise a very similar style of dress and accessories. And Muriel does seem to have some more embellished clothes as Númenórean royalty, but her clothes also look quite different in style from all the other Númenórean outfits, which I'm not sure why that is. My point is, it would be nice to see more emphasis on details in order to communicate to the audience different social status of different characters. That could be very subtle, but very effective. And also, it's difficult to disguise a cheap detail as something expensive. For example, modern synthetic machine-made lace is usually quite different than older cotton handmade lace. Hand-woven embroidery has a different look to it than machine embroidery. And that's not to say that one is better than the other, especially since there are often time and budget restrictions, and compromises absolutely need to be made for costume making. I acknowledge that. Yet there are certain elements where cutting corners results in a design that may not be that great overall.
Peter uses traditional sword-making techniques, grinding from the solid block, tooling out of spring steel, swaging wet moulded leather around the hand grip. He may use electrically powered grinders and linishes instead of foot pedal driven, but Peter's skill at bringing that level of authenticity and craftsmanship is second to none.
I don't claim to know what exactly Amazon did and how they created their costumes and armor and details. All I know is that if you're using purely modern techniques to create something antique looking, there is a high chance that something will be off about that finished product. A garment is not just the end result. It's also, and probably mainly, the process. Again, the technique doesn't have to be completely truthful to the techniques from the past because that's unreasonable, but getting close to the way something was made has a higher chance of bringing you as close to the desired result as possible. What will probably also look strange in fantasy or historical fantasy shows are printed fabrics, especially those with contemporary-looking designs. That is not to say that fabric printing didn't exist in the past, or that it can't work in a fantasy or historical fantasy show, but some abstract shapes just don't look that great in my opinion. For example, this wavy pattern, which might be representing a river or be symbolic or something like that, yet if we look at it purely as a pattern on a necklace and on armor, it seems like a very odd choice, very abstract, and more like an easy way of adding some texture. As for colors, color choices can be symbolic, for example white for Galadriel in The Lord of the Rings, or Gandalf's transformation from grey into white. They can convey the mood, like darker colors for mourning and lighter colors for happy moments. You might even have some sort of color scheme for certain characters, something that is representative of them. And color choices in general are not completely random. If you have total freedom, you will probably at least choose a color that works well with the actor's eye or skin color and so on. For example, this lovely blue that looks really nice on Galadriel, as does this green. Be it historical fiction or fiction that takes place in some undefined past, I personally think it's more believable and immersive if the color choices aren't too wild and outlandish. This does vary a bit from show to show or movie to movie, and the bold color choice and saturation might well be part of the fictional universe's color palette, like for example in Hulu's The Great. But I think in The Rings of Power this is not consistent enough that we could call it a conscious stylistic choice. This is why I think these really bold and saturated orange shades on some Númenórean outfits stand out from the rest and also kind of break the immersion. In one of my future videos, I want to talk a bit more about historical undergarments. I was going to include them here, but I thought I'd rather make a separate video on this. Also because some people have pointed out in the House of the Dragon that the outfits there lack proper undergarments, and I want to share my 2 cents on that, but also connect it to other movies and TV shows, of course. Let me know what you thought of this video and what breakdowns you would like to see next on this channel. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please leave a like and consider subscribing. I make similar content and I sew my own costume recreations as well as other stuff, so if that's something of interest to you, I'll be happy to see you stick around. I'll see you soon.